And our third speaker is Mr. Jonathan Beck. He's the Chief Strategy Officer of ACEN. Jonathan is a lawyer and a banker with over 25 years of experience in the legal, investment banking, and private investment sectors, with significant experience in equity capital markets, corporate finance, and in advising on large infrastructure, power, and telecom projects. Jonathan was previously a director and the executive chairman of BPI International Finance, the Hong Kong banking subsidiary of BPI, and concurrently co-head of wealth management and head of international businesses of BPI. He was also director of Schools Relief Initiative Limited, a Hong Kong-based charity supporting education in southern Sri Lanka. Previously, Jonathan served as an executive director in Goldman Sachs, Hong Kong, managing director and head of Asian equity capital markets in JP Morgan, Hong Kong. Jonathan holds a Bachelor of Civil Laws degree from the University of Oxford, where he graduated with first-class honors. He also received his first-class honors as solicitor. Ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker, Mr. Jonathan Beck.
Thank you very much. And can I just say what a pleasure it is to be here this afternoon to talk more about the renewable energy transition. It seems like, we're having a slight issue with the slides here, but hopefully you'll be able to see them well. If we could go to the, next slide, please. Let me tell you a little bit about ACEN, for those who don't know. We are the renewable energy platform of the Ayala Group, and a bit like what Bernd was saying about Shell Energy in the Philippines, we're a very old company. Ayala is almost 190 years old, but ACEN itself is a new company, relatively speaking. It was only founded in 2011. And we've seen a significant evolution of the company from being what I would call a participator in other people's power projects, all the way through to now being a greenfield developer of large-scale renewables projects. So if we just, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about ACEN, but I also want to put that very much in the context of what we're talking about overall, which is the need for a transition from the old ways of generating power through to what we're doing now. And as you can see here, a quote from our group chairman, Jaime Augusto Zobelda Ayala, about how Ayala saw the potential of power, the power industry generally, and then more specifically, the structural shift that we see underway globally, not just here in the Philippines, from legacy thermal generation through to renewable energy. And here in the Philippines, there's a particular issue in that we've got rapidly growing power demand. Just gross power demand across the whole economy is going up and up. That's in contrast to some of the other countries in which, including we operate. The more developed markets tend to have had pretty static power demand. Now, even there, it's starting to go up as we see the electrification of things like transportation. So if you look at the Philippines, you can see 57% of the power here is generated from coal. And as Bernd has just said in the previous session, there is a need to transition away from that. And, we are among many to recognize that gas, for example, is going to be an important transition fuel in that shift from thermal, or rather from fossil fuel generation through to a zero carbon future. But I think we aspire to that zero carbon emissions future when it comes to electricity generation. Which is why we as a company have now committed to being fully renewable in terms of our own portfolio by the end of 2025. So ACEN itself, as you can see here, has grown very significantly, even just in the last 4 or 5 years, in terms of its renewable portfolio, from 864 megawatts in 2019 to now over 4.4 gigawatts of capacity and we expect that, frankly speaking, to go up again pretty significantly soon. You can also see there that we have been divesting out of our own thermal assets, which is why that black portion there has gone down to now just 68 megawatts, which are peaking diesel-fired units. I said a moment ago that we've now got about 4.4 gigawatts of renewables, and you can see that there. What distinguishes ACEN, I frankly, is the fact that we have most of it still under construction. I think by the end of this year, you'll see the percentage that's under construction come down close to the kind of 40 to 50% range. But in a way, this is an illustration of how fast the renewable energy industry has been growing everywhere here in the Philippines, globally, and how fast it needs to grow. There's a statistic from Scientific American that while the world is, yes, installing a lot of renewable energy at the moment, if we're actually to be on a path to a net zero future in 2050, we need even today to be installing 3 times as much renewable energy as we currently are. Now, if you look at ACEN, one of the things that I think distinguishes us again is that we are present in more than one country. The Philippines is our core market, but we also have significant presence in Australia, in Vietnam and Laos, in India, with Indonesia and the US coming on behind. In fact, as well as being the largest renewables player, at least for new renewables here in the Philippines, we think we're probably either the largest or one of the largest non-Australian renewable players in Australia, and we are the largest non-Vietnamese player in the Vietnamese market. So we're very proud of those achievements, but we all have a lot more work to do in the growth of the renewable industry. You can see here our Philippine assets summarized. We have about 1.6 gigawatts, 1,600 megawatts of capacity here in the Philippines, which again, I believe makes us the largest of the players in solar and wind, especially. We are developing across all the technologies, whether it be ground-mounted solar, onshore wind. We also have offshore wind projects. We're looking at floating solar as another technology to deploy. And battery storage, we believe, is also going to be very important for all of our futures in the renewable energy industry. I think one thing that I would just note about ACEN is that one of the things that we've done as part of our evolution is move from, or we've shifted away from relatively smaller scale projects, which are, by the way, still absolutely the right thing to do in certain situations. Our focus is now more on very large scale projects where we can expand them over time. An example of that, and if you look in Ilocos Norte, you can see we've got 4 wind farms there. And that's because we've taken resources and infrastructure that we have in that place and expanded accordingly. We're doing the same with solar, for example, further south in Luzon, in Palauig and San Marcelino in Zambales province. Now, here in the Philippines, one of the drivers for all of us in the renewable energy industry is the government's target to get to 35% renewable energy output by 2030. And when you kind of back calculate on the current electricity mix to where we need to be by 2030, if we're going to get to nearly 60 terawatt hours of generation in 2030, we need about 18 gigawatts of new renewables spread across the various technologies that we've all been talking about. As you can see there, we still think it requires over 4 gigawatts of new thermal. So it's not, to get to where we as a country need to be in 2030, it's going to be kind of all of the above, but with a big emphasis on the growth of renewables. But we have to deal with the fact, of course, that it's really almost impossible to build brand new coal-fired power plants now. But we think that the government's policies actually are very much aligned with making this transition happen, and particularly the renewable portfolio standards, the green energy option program, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and for us in the generation business, the green energy auction program, where the government is essentially allowing companies to bid their projects in to get a 20-year fixed rate tariff. Our own expansion in the Philippines is summarized quickly on this slide. I don't think I need to say much more about it, and I'll turn now to the international assets that we have. So, as well as being a significant player here, as I said a moment ago, Australia and Vietnam are in particular very important markets for us, but we would like to do a lot more around the rest of the region, especially, frankly, in Indonesia, where the growth in the renewables sector has been kind of slow. People sometimes ask us, you know, why are we in so many different markets? Well, frankly speaking, just like Shell, we see a lot of benefits in economies of scale across these markets, not least from the perspective of purchasing solar panels, purchasing wind turbines, but also the expertise that we develop in one market, we can easily deploy into other markets. And we've seen that in the past, where we've had teams from the Philippines go to Vietnam to help with the construction of all these many projects that you can see there. Similarly, we've got a pumped hydro storage project underway in Australia. There'll be learnings from that we would love to bring here to the Philippines. If you look at Australia, for example, why is that a fascinating market for us? Well, it's a bit like it's a little bit different compared to here in the Philippines, where you've got a lot of older coal-fired power stations that need to be retired. And again, they're not going to build any new coal-fired power stations. They have to replace that with renewables for the most part, which is why some of our, in fact, I can say that our largest single power plants are being built in Australia at the moment. And we expect to do much more of that kind of thing, not just solar, but also wind and pumped hydro. Now, I said we were in some of these other markets. Vietnam is a very important market for us, as I said a moment ago. And as you may know, the growth there has been extremely impressive. They've had 7% GDP growth, and they've also had electricity demand growth of a similar nature, largely driven by the growth of the manufacturing sector in Vietnam. As many of you will know, there's been many companies have a policy of multiple sources for that offshore production, and Vietnam has been a big beneficiary of that. Now, if we look at the commitments that we've made as a company and indeed as a group, we've committed as a group to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. One of the things that we've done as a practical matter is sell our coal-fired power station that we used to own, SL Tech, 246 megawatts in southern Luzon, as part of an ADB inspired energy transition mechanism, and we expect to see more of that kind of thing happen in the future, largely to enable the early retirement of coal-fired power plants. Now, if you look at this, and I just thought it'd be interesting to include this just to show the scale of the challenge that we all face, and by all I mean everybody, practically speaking, on planet Earth. Switching from fossil fuels all the way through to a completely net zero future is going to be an enormous challenge. And you can see the kind of the scale of this summarized in that graph on the right-hand side of the page. And the truth is that there is no practical way where you just suddenly switch off all of the fossil fuels and instantly you've gone to renewable energy. As Carmela was saying earlier, you've got intermittency issues as much as anything else. At least here in the Philippines, we have the benefit of year-round sunshine, which helps when it comes to the generation of solar. Wind is seasonal for us. But if you think about a typical Northern European country or Japan, for example, there's not a lot of solar in the winter, and sometimes you don't even get that much wind on cool, calm, cold, calm days. What do? Well, we believe that other technologies, including, to be honest, nuclear, are going to be particularly important for economies like that. We also think that the use of green hydrogen will eventually become important. That's something that potentially we don't need here in the Philippines, but let's see. We may very well do so. So the increasing electrification, which I'm sorry about the quality of the transmission on the slide here, but anyway, we can see here across industrial, transport and buildings that there is an enormous shift needed if we're going to get to that zero carbon future. Because what a lot of people don't appreciate is that if you electrify everything, in the expression of the industry, Bloomberg reckon that you need approximately 3 times as much aggregate electricity generation on the planet as we currently do. So that, of course, is a huge, huge challenge. And hopefully these charts here give you some sense of the scale of that challenge, because it is very, very significant. Now, we here in ACEN are also in the retail electricity supply business. We've got 200 businesses. I mean, there are more than 200 businesses now saving millions by switching to renewable energy. The green energy option program that I mentioned a while ago, and that our other speakers have referenced as well, is a very important program from the government to enable customers to switch to renewable sources as long as you've got 100 kilowatts load and upwards, and you need those green energy certificates. You can work with any supplier. Obviously, I'm from ACEN. We think that ACEN is the best possible option. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we've energy security, affordability, and sustainability are what we're offering to our customers. You can see there a photograph of our Alaminos solar plant not too far from us here in Manila. So I think the key take, if I can just go on a couple of slides. Yeah, so we're trying to make that shift as convenient as possible for our customers. And the key takeaways I'd leave you with are that we're helping to catalyze the energy transition, not just here in the Philippines, but across the region and in Australia. It's an obvious statement, but nonetheless true, that renewables are critical for our energy needs, but also our energy security. Bear in mind that renewables don't require to be imported, and I think that's actually one of the focuses of the current government. We would encourage all businesses to look at the Green Energy Option Program, and frankly, whether it's us or another supplier, you will benefit by moving your power needs to renewables. So at that point, I'd like to thank you very much and look forward to the panel discussion that's going to follow.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Now we will be having our panel discussion. And for that, let me introduce to you our moderator for the panel discussion. Our moderator for this is Michael Guarin. Mike Guarin is a partner at KPMG RG Manabat and Company, current FINEX Foundation Chairman, and 2022 President of FINEX. He is also the subcommittee chair of the technical sessions for FINEX Week. Okay, let us all welcome Mike Guarin as the moderator. Mike?
All right. Thank you, Tony Boy. Good afternoon. Well done to our speakers. Thank you, Jonathan, Mela, and Brent. Really very informative items and presentation decks. So first of all, I would like to remind our audience members that we do have a Q&A button readily available for you. Feel free to post your questions and we'll try to get to them during our maybe 30-minute panel discussions. So I think there's really no question that renewable energy is a key factor for the future of the world, not just for the Philippines. So the intention here is to try to touch on specific subtopics. No? So first question here would be, as you know, we do have a new government in place, and transitioning from the old government to the current one, more emphasis was made on targets, the mix of renewable energy relative to total, right? So around 35% of total mix in the Philippines should be at that level by 2035, and then 50% by 2040. So coming from the experts, I just wanted to get your thoughts. Is it too aggressive, or are we not aggressive enough? And what do you think is our state or trend given what you're seeing now? Given that Mela was the first presenter, may I ask Mela first, then we'll just go to Bernd, and then lastly back to Jonathan.
Right.
Go ahead, please, Mela.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think Jonathan touched on it earlier during his portion. It is quite aggressive, the targets, given our current state, and 2035 is just around the corner. So for us to catch that target, I don't know how we're gonna do it, to be honest. And like what Jonathan also mentioned, it's not really as easy as it's not an overnight thing. It is a major transition, and it's really something that we really need to plan for, given the required security stability for the grid.
Thank you, Mela. How about you, Bernd? Happy to hear from you.
So certainly, I mean, we very much appreciate all the efforts the new administration has been implementing. We see clearly a strong shift towards the positive. Jonathan mentioned the various elements, GUP, GUP, and so on. For me, the targets cannot be aggressive enough, provided that the framework around it is robust, and there is an openness and transparency on all the weaknesses, and the weaknesses been spotted and being worked on. And there is, in order to achieve those ambitions, unfortunately, there are quite a number of those gaps that need to be addressed. For me, it always starts with we need to have a very blunt and realistic assessment of the situation of the status quo. The planning needs to be realistic as well. I mean, and then we can give many examples of where there is at least a question mark, just to name offshore wind, COD data offshore wind, question mark. A lot of new plans being projected. Are we able to have a speedy assessment, system impact studies? Are we today? It takes me, I don't know what's the latest, 18 months to get a slot for a system impact study. So these are gaps that need to be addressed. Energy storage solutions, and we're going to come to that in a second, is the regulatory framework for battery solutions. There's work to be done. When I inject into a battery, as long as I'm being treated right now as a customer, as a demand, and being charged with all the transmission cost, that is difficult for any battery investment, and so on. So a couple of them, the direction clearly is very, very positive. The targets are positive, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
All right. Thank you, Bernd. Over to you, Jonathan.
Yes, I would also like to echo how helpful we think the government's policies have been of late. We do think that the commitment to renewable energy is very real and is not a transitory thing. And it's been done for all the right reasons. It's not just about the switch from polluting industries to clean industries. It's also because there's an eye to energy security, to reducing the forex load that is related to imported fuels. All of those are good things. I would certainly agree with Bernd, though, on the challenges that still exist for the industry as a whole in order to achieve anything like the 18 gigawatts that I mentioned, that 35% by 2030. We ourselves have done quite a careful look at what we think is going to happen across the entire industry, not just us, across the entire industry from now to 2030. And when I said 18 gigawatts, I meant 18 gigawatts operating. In 2030, not under construction, operating. And that is going to be a challenge, frankly speaking. We think it's possible we might get there on the solar. We're more cautious, to be honest with you, for wind, both even for onshore wind, and I suspect that the operations dates for offshore wind are going to be, they could pose challenges as well, to say the least. I mean, if you look at the history of offshore wind in other markets, it has taken quite a while for any kind of supply chain to really develop and for plants to be installed as rapid. I mean, in the North Sea, yes, you can now install offshore wind extremely quickly because they've got an entire supply chain kitted out for it, etc., etc. But you know, the costs of offshore wind are also something that has to be borne in mind. I mean, one point we haven't touched on yet, but I'll be guilty of negligence if I didn't mention it, is transmission, which I think is an issue for everybody.
For everyone.
And I can see nods from other panelists because it really is a big deal. Honestly, not just in the Philippines, but almost everywhere that we operate, transmission is often the single defining factor on whether a project can get done, and particularly if it can get done on any sort of reasonable time scale. So I would just like to make that point because we also think that the government is doing the right thing when it comes to, if I can put it politely, encouraging greater speed in the rollout of the sort of transmission network we all need to enable the transition to renewables.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. And it's good that Bernd mentioned, well, Mela likewise mentioned the challenges, right, that we are currently faced with, potential bottlenecks. So we'd like to think that government has been relatively easier to reach this time around, right? We've been counting some of their public sessions. They've been sharing more regarding their plans, and not just their plans, but rather the actual steps needed to reach those plans. So I wanted to check whether from the industry, is there a group in place that is meant to relay all of these? I'm sure government already is aware, but to emphasize how urgent the problem is, and maybe on a sector-wide basis come up with new solutions or improvements to current ones to try to meet the plans on hand. Anyone can try to answer that clarification.
I mean, yes, there are industry bodies that cooperate on sending these messages to the government. I mean, honestly, I think all avenues that can be pursued are welcome, but I'd just endorse what you said about access to the key parties involved at various levels, whether it's the DOE or ERC, etc. I think we've found that to be ourselves to be highly beneficial for getting the message across. And as we've seen, that there's a lot of participation in pretty public events where that kind of support is evident from the different layers of government. In fact, frankly, up to the president himself.
All right. Care to add, Bernd or Mela?
I can only echo what Jonathan said. I mean, there are all different bodies in place, and we are also using all the avenues that we have at hand to deliver our messages and convey the messages. But it comes back to my point in it's a huge effort. It is a huge task, and one needs to be realistic and really from the beginning have a very clear picture on what are the priorities and work those priorities, and then everything in the end, in order to reach those ambitions, those very high ambitions, things need to fall in place. And then clearly external events that caught us last year and still catches us this year, I mean, they are not, there's little contingency, say, in the plan. So everything needs to fall in place, but it comes down to be very open, be very transparent, be realistic, and then for me, a Shell, and I'm sure the industry is ready to work very closely together with the government in order to make that happen, because ultimately it comes to the benefit of all the Filipino nations. And you have such a beautiful country. I love to keep that free.
All right. Anything to add, Mela?
Yeah, well, yeah, I just want to reiterate like what Jonathan mentioned and also Bernd. I mean, open communication lines are there. And we also have that industry organization called PIPA, where we use that avenue as well when communicating the views of the industry players and getting the message across to the relevant agencies. And government departments or regulators as a whole. So it is open, and I think they are also proactive when it comes to making sure or trying to achieve what the goals are for the country. But again, it's a lot of work, as mentioned by my co-panelists here.
All right, and then I think one thread that's common would be essentially the ease of doing business, right? The less friction, events that will lead to friction, the faster it will be for the sector to roll things out. So I'd like to connect this to, obviously the Philippines is merely one of the investment destinations for renewable energy investments, the funds, and even the technology. So what we are keeping track of is what we call the Renewable Energy Country Attractiveness Index. So right now that index covers around 40 countries, and the Philippines is fortunately ranked still within the middle pack. I think we're currently 21st or 23rd out of those 40 countries being tracked. So in relation to that, Jonathan, you did mention that essentially your ACEN has presence, Australia, India, Vietnam, among others. How much easier or how more difficult is it to roll out a new project or doing business in general, comparing those other countries to the Philippines?
A difficult question sometimes to answer very diplomatically. I think we would say that every country has its own challenges, to be honest with you. And it also, a lot depends on the level of government support for the industry in total. So if you look at Vietnam, for example, Vietnam is the poster child, so to speak, for a country that has seen an incredibly rapid deployment of renewables, thanks to government policy, basically a feed-in tariff. So they've gone from, call it 500 megawatts to 20 gigawatts, 20,000 megawatts in the space of 5 years, which is an astonishing achievement. And they've done it because they said, right, if you can get your project permitted and built within this time frame, we will give you a feed-in tariff of X, and with X being a sufficiently attractive enough number to get a lot of people very interested, including us. So we now have about 1,000 megawatts in ourselves in Vietnam. But there are other aspects of government policy in Vietnam that, frankly speaking, are relatively opaque and can sometimes present challenges for wanting to commit to new power projects. The Philippines obviously hasn't had quite such a rush to renewables driven by a feed-in tariff policy. But on the other hand, the government now does have the Green Energy Auction Program, which is starting to encourage more investment. But to be honest, it's got to be at a price, a reserve price that makes sense for the industry.
Take-up wasn't good during the last. I understand that the take-up last June for GIAP was not ideal.
No, that would be, to say the, yeah, I mean, particularly on the solar, it wasn't great. I mean, I dare say that future rounds of GIAP will adjust accordingly. That seems to be an indication. I mean, we ourselves bid a wind project into this last round of GIAP and won on the tariff that we submitted, so we're very happy about that. But I think that's telling you that probably where they've set the wind tariff is a good place to be. The solar tariff may need to be just a wee bit higher to get as much interest as they need. That's what the Vietnamese did. They provided an attractive tariff that led to this deluge of interest, frankly speaking, and a very rapid build out. So I don't think there's any one country on earth, to be honest with you, that's got it all right. If you ask yourself which country has managed to achieve the fastest rollout of any in the world, it's definitely Vietnam because of their policies there. We feel at the moment actually that the Philippine policy is in a pretty decent place, but it needs some adjustments here and there to make it that much more likely that we're going to get to that 35% by 2030 and 50% by 2040. But yeah, no, there's no one size fits all. Every market is somewhat different. But I think we would agree that the Philippines is at least in the middle of the pack and may now be starting to head up the pack in terms of ability to get things done.
Thank you, Jonathan. Anything to add, Brent and Mela, before we proceed to the next question?
Well, I mean, a few points, if you allow. I mean, investment. I mean, looking at all the amounts of developers now coming into the country, identifying projects and wanting to develop solar, it's a fantastic place right now for developing solar. Foreign ownership restriction and so on, that's great, great achievement as well.
Yeah.
The downside, however, is we cannot build a renewable business on the back of solar only. So it becomes more critical when you look at the battery plays, wind investments, and so on. So there, it's not. These are usually capex heavy decisions. They are larger in scale, where then ultimately also the management of the risks becomes an issue. So we have in the Philippines, other than when you in more developed markets like in Europe and US, where corporate PPAs as a buzzword is really the enabler to get larger investments off the ground. That is in a very, very early stage in the Philippines, meaning long-term commitments by end customers, which then ultimately allow the investment in a generation asset. That is something which we need to, as an industry, together need to get going, because ultimately that is what it's, in my view, what it from a Shell perspective, the main challenge is what do I do? How do I manage my exposure, my investment exposure in year 10, year 15, going further down the road? That's a question mark. And then the other one is we need to get a energy derivatives market off the ground sooner than later in the Philippines. There is right now, unfortunately, a complete absence of risk management opportunities in the market in the short term, and that is something I think that would help us very much in order to attract more investments in the country. And the final word, and then I'm quiet. We've been talking about the generation side, but someone needs to bring that to the customers, need to provide those solutions to the customers. I think it's all to the benefit of us in the Philippines if we lower the entry barriers for new players in the market for RES. And I can tell you, as a RES being new in the market for the last 3-4 years, that is not easy. There's a lot of entry, a lot of hurdles you need to manage. And I'm just to mention, I mean, looking at the tax legislation and recent changes in the Western market and so on, there's a lot of work to be done. It's not an easy market from that perspective to enter.
All right. So, Mela, any comments here? All right. So, definitely a lot of questions from the audience. I'll just go through some of them. So we have this one question from an anonymous attendee. So one of the congressmen from Pangasinan is advocating and working for nuclear power energy. So is this in line with renewable source of energy conforming with the green economy initiatives? Can we have your view on this, please? Who would like to take that question?
Mela, please.
Mela, ladies first.
Well, renewable, I don't know if it can be considered renewable, but I don't know if you read in the papers, maybe a couple of weeks back, there are studies being conducted for small modular reactors for SPUGs or for island grids, because I don't even know if nuclear would be ideal for the Philippines, given that we are located in the Ring of Fire, right? So I'm not sure if maybe with advancements in technology, I don't know, maybe it could work for us. But for the SMRs, there are studies being conducted, but I don't think this is something that we can see in the near future, because first of all, regulatory work has to be done. I mean, new rules and regulations for that kind of technology has to be in place before we can actually put them to use. I think based on our discussions with one US-based company, minimum 10 years before we can actually see those SMRs being rolled out here in the Philippines. But yeah, I mean, in terms of cheaper reliability or more reliable source of power, nuclear is one technology that could provide that.
Thank you, Mela. Either Bernd or Jonathan?
I mean,
additional.
but
Maybe, well, coming from Europe, a big question, a big discussion around whether that nuclear is seen to be green or not. I'll leave it to you to look up the EU statements on this one. I mean, Germany, I'm coming from Germany, we have a controversial view on that. We've just exited and shut down the last nuclear plant in Germany and have no ambitions to go back into that. From a Shell point of view, we see that the classical nuclear plants as a technology of the past. We think it's too expensive. Looking at the risk reward, it is, if something happens, then the impact is enormous. So from that point of view, we're not engaging in any nuclear plants going forward. And the last comment, again, linking back to being realistic. I mean, yes, we can talk about whatever these mini reactors or whatever, but that is years. I'm certainly going to be retired by then, and rejuvenating Bataan. I mean, I have my sincere question marks around that.
Thanks, Bernd. Any last comments, Jonathan, in relation to nuclear?
Yeah, I think if there is a future for a country that has never deployed nuclear before, it's only in SMRs or even newer technology like thorium bed reactors. I mean, there are effectively nuclear technologies that could be deployed in the longer term future that are inherently much safer than a typical fission reactor. Who knows? a fusion-based solution could one day be workable. And, you know, frankly speaking, we see it as part of our job to keep an eye on all that into the future, because who knows, if somebody does come up with a commercially viable fusion platform, it will be highly significant for everybody. Let's not pretend otherwise. But it's you know, the old joke about fusion power is that fusion power is 20 years away and always will be. So that's the sort of thing we have to just grapple with. That's why I mentioned things like green hydrogen, etc. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So going back to one of the questions from our audience. So given that some ESG monitoring groups cover LNG in their watch list, in addition to coal, so from your vantage point, how extensive now is this potential pushback on LNG, Philippines or even globally? But since Bernd, you also mentioned this in your deck, maybe you can care to answer this first.
Whether it's, so the question is whether it pushes back the LNG. I don't see that. I don't see that. We don't see that. We see there is the need for LNG. Actually, we simply looking at right now, give you a number. The coal-fired generation right now is around about 3 to 4 times the current LNG that is traded around the market, around the globe. So there's a lot of replacement still to be done. And LNG, obviously, gas is significantly lower in its emission than coal. So I think there is a strong place for gas.
Yeah. All right. Same views, Jonathan, Mela?
Yes, I mean, as I said when I was speaking, you know, realistically, you need gas transition fuel on your journey to 2050, or, you know, from a net zero perspective, even beyond that. But yeah.
And
then Mela, before we move on to the next question.
No, see,
yeah,
I think LNG would be our transition from the typical or the usual coal to RE or green or clean energy.
Okay. And the next question would be essentially another inherent challenge in developing renewable energy, specifically solar. There's always that push and pull with agriculture, right? So it's the trade-off with using up more land, but you know, there'll be less space for food, or even, so that's agri and renewable energy. And then another aspect would be a lot of the raw materials or inputs that go into renewable energy come from the mining industry. So I wanted to get your views on this. Mela, is that okay? We go first with you.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a balance that we have to figure out, right? Food security versus RE, right? So I don't think there's any regulation out there as of the moment capping the use of land for both purposes, right? So, but I think this is something that we actually, or the government actually has to think about. Especially Philippines, we're very reliant on imported rice, for example. So this is something that we really need to think about. What was the other one? Sorry.
Agri and renewable, and then mining. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's like what I said, right? We need to consider how we also dispose or dispose the resources that we extract after we use them. That's something that we need to figure out as well.
Thank you. And then Jonathan or Bernd, care to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, on the mining side, you know, just to be candid, unless some things are dug out of the ground, you do not have a 21st century economy of any description, you know, just to be blunt about it. So the renewable energy industry and electric vehicles, for example, all need a lot of lithium. They need a lot of copper, especially metals like that. If we're not able to extract those, you literally just can't do it. Stop. There is no more renewable energy transition. So what is the right balance, as Mela just said, to strike in this whole thing? And similarly with land use, we're very conscious of preferring to use land for solar that is marginal land and is not otherwise quite as not be otherwise so appropriate for full-scale agriculture. For example, that San Marcelino solar plant I showed you is built on a lahar field from Mount Pinatubo, so that nothing much was growing there anyway. That's the perfect place to put a very large solar farm. That's exactly what we're doing. But it is something, again, that we have to keep in mind as we achieve this balance for the whole, when you take into account the entire ecosphere, as it were.
Thank you, Jonathan. And then moving on, we have a question here from one of our active members, Vic Sarza. So his question is, he wonders where the log jam is in respect to meeting the 2035 targets. Hopefully you can see the question here, as it appears that the playing field is more than level now compared to 5 or 10 years ago. And then solar panels are cheaper, and it takes a shorter time to set up wind and solar plants. And then renewables are still on a must-dispatch basis. So, Bernd, you mentioned earlier the length of time needed to finish some of the required studies prior as part of the development of renewable energy sites. So, and then the exact number of permits needed from scratch moving on to operational phase. Care to mention some more items that's really causing the logjam in terms of trying to meet those lofty targets from the government?
I mean, I'm pretty. I mean, you repeated just those critical ones. I'm less concerned about all the activities that happen on the solar side. There's many projects. I'm concerned, obviously, on the choice, coming to your previous question on the proper land and so on. So we need to be very selective. But the solar, I think that is pretty much we're underway. I'm concerned about, in order, if you want to meet those targets, what is happening in addition to solar. What is happening on the battery side? What is happening on the wind side specifically? Because when I look at it from a customer perspective, the solar is nice, but in the Philippines we have the highest demand in the evening hours, and when you look at the daily prices in the market, you have the peaks in the evening hours. And that's only going to increase those tightness in the market. And how are we going to address that? And you need to address that ultimately if you want to convince a customer. And I'm linking it back to the corporate PPA side. Yeah. I need a long-term offtake agreement in order to get projects off the ground. In order to do that, I need to deliver to my customer 100% renewable energy. That means I need to solve the problems what is happening outside solar hours. Right. And batteries only may help me left and right, but it doesn't help me in the evening. And those elements we need to address.
Understood. Thank you, Brent. Anything to add, Jonathan or Mela?
Very much echo what Bernd just said then.
Yeah.
All right. So, and then one question from Attorney Leia Roque, one of our FINEX members and principal at Punong Bayan. For you, are the incentives and support given by the government to renewable energy companies comparable to the same incentives and supports granted in other countries where you operate in, or at least where you have visibility in? Maybe if you can take that question, Jonathan.
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned earlier, we think the government policy at the moment is actually headed in the right direction on many of these aspects, including a more ambitious green energy auction program for renewable energy. I mean, arguably, there are aspects of it that are almost, that are perhaps even ahead of where the industry currently is. But broadly, I think Vietnamese policy in the past, in certain respects, was particularly supportive of driving the growth of renewable energy. But if I was to look today, October the 4th, 2023, today I would say the Philippines was actually overall had a much more, not a much more, but a more constructive overall regime in place for the renewable energy industry. India is an interesting example because there again they're making a massive push to renewable energy. So you can argue that they have some of the most supportive policies at the moment. Australia is slightly more, there are no feed-in tariffs or anything like that. They're more about we will try and create things like renewable energy zones to make things a little bit easier for you. But it's not. I wouldn't say it's overall as supportive as Philippine government policy is, whatever they may say. And also, it depends on state by state.
Okay. I've been told that we need to wrap this up. We'll send over some of the questions that are still unanswered, and then we'll see if we can share it with those who asked those questions. But before we officially wrap up, maybe we can give you a chance to share any parting words to our audience members. And then by order of presentation, let's start with you, Mela.
Well, again, I'd like to thank again FINEX for giving us this opportunity to share our views on RE. And as mentioned earlier, and I'd like to repeat it again, we need to be pragmatic about this transition from our current state to where we want to be. We'd like to support the government's initiatives on heading towards that sustainable future, and hoping that both regulatory and both private and public sectors work together towards that goal.
Thank you, Mela. Over to you, Bryn.
Now it's my 4th year in the Philippines, and I couldn't imagine a better place to live here. The opportunities, both from the people, from the nature, but also from a business point of view, from the opportunities that the nation provides, with the demand around the corner, fantastic play. If we look left and right and with open eyes, take the right learnings, combine that with realistic analysis of the status quo, and bring that together, I think the future is fantastic. The opportunities are fantastic for this country to lead the pack, to continue to lead the pack in terms of economic growth in Southeast Asia, but also to lead the pack in terms of transition towards renewable energy and meeting those 35% or even more.
Thank you, Bryn. Jonathan.
I would certainly just like to emphasize everything that Mela and Bernd have just said about the need to be pragmatic. But in particular, there's no one-size-fits-all solution everywhere. I mean, in the Philippines, there are many smaller communities, islands, etc., that are going to need their own renewable energy solutions, which may be different to what happens in Luzon, etc. Government policy ultimately is absolutely critical in making this happen. The private sector, we can and should do everything we can, but we have to work hand in glove with the government in order to make all this happen. That's true in the Philippines, and it's true everywhere. I mean, we are particularly excited. I mean, we're a global, certainly a regional company, and hand on heart, we are still most excited about the opportunities here in the Philippines. So I'll leave it at that.
It's nice to hear those final words from our speakers, Jonathan Bach, ACEN, Bernd Kruckenberg, Shell Energy Philippines, and Ms. Mela Franco from Vivant Corporation. We definitely appreciate the time that you've spent and for sharing your knowledge, albeit very briefly. 2 hours is just not enough. But again, thank you very much on behalf of FINEX. We hope to see you again, and we hope to work with you and to support this much needed initiative for the government and for the country.